Hello everyone, welcome to GGN. Today is Monday, March 4th, 2013, and I'm Darko. Alright, I'm going to cover a series of articles in this first report. It's going to be kind of a different theme. The main theme, hopefully, that you get from this is the kind of engineered rise and fall of the United States. And here's some leaders basically speaking what they think about it. Western civilization on path of decadence, says the Ayatollah of Iran. He says Western civilization has its roots in humanism, with a view to political power, and then a capital-based perspective. And after its heyday, the signs of decay and decadence have currently come to the surface. So the emergence of the problems and decadence of the Western civilization is due to the absence of spirituality. And in this video, you have Farrakhan, who I agree with on some issues about Zionists and that, and what happened to Gaddafi, but, you know, there's some people, of course, that think that he's part of the, quote, establishment or the powers that be, so take it for what it's worth. But he makes some pretty strong comments in there, so, which is interesting because he calls out Obama, but at the same time he knows that the American people, which he admits, you know, are not really rising up, but you have militias and patriots and different types of organizations that are not liking their rights to be trampled anymore. So that's, I mean, he basically talks about that, but at the same time says, you know, U.S. has everything that's coming to them they deserve. So Russia must also keep America at gunpoint. Interesting little quote here from this Russian military general. Tactical nuclear weapons that are constantly threatening the U.S. must become the factor that will deter large-scale aggression. Holding it at gunpoint, this is a deterrent, says the General Colonel in the reserve Russian army. So I guess he says here, a professor in an interview, Mr. Ivashov, your forecasts of what is going on with Russia's defensive ability and generally your views of Russia's current position in the world are very pessimistic and critical. You said that Russia has lost all allies during the recent years. Who are we allies? Says who we are allies except for our army and navy. So I don't know what that means, but the author goes on there and talks about China and how China sometimes acts like they're allies, but makes decisions behind Russia's back and kind of has an eye on, you know, like that living space idea or concept. Cardinal, U.S. Pope would be unwise. This is something that I saw, and I'm not, what do you call it, advocating Roman Catholicism, but it's just another theme that I saw, which surrounding this whole Pope thing. Of course, there's people out there, or conspiracy theorists, that say the Zionists are behind the whole bashing of the Catholic Church. But then there's people that say that the Roman Catholic Church was set up by the powers that be. So again, you know, make up your own mind. But U.S. Pope would be unwise. So Archbishop of Washington today argued against electing a pope from the United States because the pontiff would be conflicted about delivering the spiritual challenge that a superpower needs from time to time. So because there, yeah, it says here, as a pope from the superpower would probably have a lot going against him when he's trying to present a spiritual message to the rest of the world. Then you have this, Canada's Ouellet suggests others may be better for Pope. Canadian Cardinal, one of the leading candidates to succeed Pope Benedict, suggested in an interview with Canada's national broadcaster that other candidates for Pope might do a better job. Of course, you have this, which I've already covered before, from the Jewish Chronicle. U.S. big guns row over the Honduran hate Pope candidate. The Harvard academic has hit out, this Dershowitz has hit out at an anti-defamation league over its support for an allegedly anti-Semitic candidate for next Pope, saying he intends to fight this all the way to Rome. So it goes on here, and he accused the Cardinal of Honduras of propagating conspiracy theories about Jews, describing him as an unrepentant sinner who has compared the Jewish-controlled media to Hitler for its persecution of the church. Okay, next up. Tax changes drive surge in Americans renouncing citizenship. We are well aware of the infamous French dramatics as the wealthy flee the country over the changing tax structure, but few know that Americans renouncing citizenship has tripled in the last few years, according to the Telegraph. That many have given up citizenship in the United States after the U.S. tax return process. So since the tax laws changed in 2008, it says here all Americans are required to file a tax return on their worldwide income, even if they have not visited the U.S. for decades. So the number of renunciations has risen from 231 per year to 1,781. Then we have U.S. Department of Justice acknowledges Aaron Swartz was persecuted over his political views. The decision to hound Swartz on flimsy charges, with the possibility of decades in prison, was part of an anti-copyright manifesto written by Swartz in 2008, reports the Huffington Post. The manifesto said sharing information was a moral imperative and advocated for civil disobedience against copyright laws pushed by corporations blinded by greed that led to the privatization of knowledge. So the individual who supposedly killed himself had been indicted and faced a prison sentence for downloading millions of academic articles from the online database. Is copyright infringement now seen as terrorism? That's the question. Government uses law as a sword against dissent. So the Washington blog last year reported the government treats copyright infringers as terrorists, and SWAT teams have been deployed against them. So it's similar to these activists on the streets of protesters, including Occupy and environmental activists treated as terrorists as well. So it goes on, it says the administration publishes a newsletter about its efforts with language that compares copyright infringement to terrorism. The American government is using copyright laws to crack down on political dissent like China and Russia. So they go in there and point out the recent cybersecurity bill that was supposedly pushed by Obama. It says it's not just intellectual property. The government is widely using anti-terror laws to help giant businesses and to crush those who speak out against their abusive practices, labeling anyone who speaks out as a potential bad guy. Then we have the NYPD lied under oath to prosecute Occupy activists. So Occupy Wall Street activists was acquitted, one of them, of assaulting a police officer and other charges on Thursday after jurors were presented with video evidence that directly contradicted the NYPD's story. So he was found innocent of all charges. This was December 17, 2011, in the Occupy Wall Street demonstration in Lower Manhattan. So it had involved this individual, Primo, known artist and activist. After being arrested, basically the police department of the district's attorney basically gave him a deal that would let him off the hook by pleading guilty to lesser charges. Maintaining his innocence, he was determined to fight the case in court, so I guess he won. Activists arrested for wearing Occupy Everything jacket. If you're planning a trip to Washington, D.C., you might want to choose your wardrobe more wisely, says federal judge says a Florida man was not wrongly arrested for wearing an Occupy Everything jacket inside the Supreme Court. Goes on, it says inside the Supreme Court building last year when a guard told him that he had to do something about his homemade jacket that he was wearing. The slogan was painted on his coat, "Occupy Everything," constitute a form of demonstration, the security guard said. The District of Columbia and their courts have repeatedly found that the Supreme Court, with the except of sidewalks near the street on the perimeter of the court grounds, is non-public forum for First Amendment purposes. A billionaire tells Americans to prepare for financial ruin. The United States could soon become a large-scale Spain or Greece, teetering on the edge of financial ruin. That's according to Donald Trump, who painted a very ugly picture of where the country is headed. He made comments during a recent appearance on Fox News. He says here that the United States is no longer a rich country. When you're not rich, you have to go out and borrow money. He says we're borrowing from the Chinese and others, and we're up to $16 trillion in debt. Well, in all reality, that's how the United States was kind of started with Hamilton, and that was to basically take on debt and issue currency. And of course, we had the financial coup by Zionists known as the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Billionaires are dumping stocks, and economists know why. They said despite the 6.5% stock market rally over the last 3 months, a handful of billionaires are quietly dumping their American stocks, and fast. Warren Buffett, who has been a cheerleader for the U.S. stocks for quite some time, is dumping shares at an alarming rate. Actually, he also just got bumped down as on Forbes' list. So I just saw that today. 70% of the U.S. economy dependent on consumer spending. Buffett's apparent lack of faith in these companies' future prospects is worrisome. So he says he's not alone. It goes on here and talks about other billionaires. We have Soviet-style collapse looms ahead of the European Union, says Soros. In a recent TV interview, head of the Soros Foundation and a key architect of the color revolutions in the former Soviet republics criticized the former Soviet Union for adopting a series of economic policies which led to the disintegration of the superpower in 1991 and warned that the EU may face the same fate. He contended that Brussels' strategies aimed at supporting a unified currency for the bloc will exacerbate the EU's social and political problems. Also, he warned Germany warned Germany against throwing its weight behind the economic austerity policies of the EU as the strategy will provoke backlash against Berlin. EU chief uses speech to attack Britain. It says Herman Van Rompuy says leaving the EU doesn't come for free, warned that Britain would pay a high price if it voted to quit the EU. So a nice little white-collar corporate blackmail or something. And he said changing EU treaties was not the priority for Brussels. I'm sure it isn't, because those treaties are binding and they try to bind them for life, to enslave those people, to lose their sovereignty. So no, they don't want to change the treaties. It's funny, he says leaving the club altogether, as a few advocate, is legally possible. We have an exit clause, he said, but it's not a matter of just walking out. It would be legally and politically a most complicated and unpractical affair. Yeah, the Eurozone reports record joblessness and low inflation. The unemployment rate in the Eurozone edged up in January to another record, official data showed on Friday. Then to the U.S., it says here, the U.S. economy grew slowest since 2011. This is from the 28th of February. It barely grew in the fourth quarter, although a slightly better performance in exports and fewer imports led the government to scratch an earlier estimate that showed an economic contraction. Americans see biggest monthly income drop in 20 years from the 1st of March. It says feeling poor. Americans saw their income drop so dramatically in January that it marked the deepest one-month decline in 20 years. Personal income decreased by $500 billion in January, 3.6% compared to December, the most dramatic decrease since January 1993, according to the Commerce Department. Says, well, yeah, it basically goes on and talks about the tax hikes, and that's what we were talking about in January and February, that it's really hitting people hard in the earlier beginning of the year. China fully prepared for currency war. Top Chinese banker says Beijing is fully prepared for a currency war as he urged the world to abide by a consensus reached by the G20 to avert confrontation. And I'll still remember that those articles we covered, that it's not so much a trade or currency war as it is a trade war, and trade wars and currency wars lead to hot wars. So, we'll see though. But you know, people are buying ships. People, different countries or blocks are flexing their muscles. So who knows? Maybe it will happen. Maybe, you know, I don't know. Banks admit wrongly foreclosing on U.S. troops. At least 700 active duty troops lost homes during crisis. America's biggest banks have admitted that they wrongfully foreclosed on the homes of at least 700 military personnel, in some cases evicting families while troops were still serving in war zones. This was done by Citibank and Wells Fargo. It's basically surfaced during an investigation. And in Spain, homeless people are taking over vacant apartment buildings. She says, life changes when you lose everything. There was a time when I was happy just to work and look after my home. Now at the age of 65, I've suddenly become an activist. So it goes on and says their slogan is no people without houses, no houses without people. This is Kerala Utopia, the first in a growing network of previously vacant properties in the capital of Seville. It says here, now occupied by victims of Spain's ongoing economic crisis. I'll still dub it the wealth consolidation operation. Serbian man has lived inside grave for 15 years. This is actually from the 16th of February, but it's still an interesting story. He began sleeping with the dead when he moved in the cemetery 15 years ago. He says living with the dead isn't as scary as one might think. I was afraid at the beginning, but I got used to it in time. Now I'm more afraid of the living than the dead. California woman dies after nurse refuses to do CPR. Police are investigating whether there was any criminal wrongdoing in the handling of a health emergency at an independent living facility, where a woman died after a nurse refused to give CPR. The facility defended its nurse, saying she had followed policy. The dispatcher pleaded with the nurse to perform CPR on the woman. The nurse refused, saying that one of the home's policies prevented her from doing CPR. The dispatcher said, I understand if your boss is telling you you can't do it, but as a human being, you know, is there anybody that's willing to help this lady and not let her die? It's ironic, too, that they call it assisted living, because it's really a place that you send your loved ones to die. But they were just following protocol, because it's all about liability and insurance. You can go up and check this article from John Rappaport, and it says 225,000 Americans, almost 250,000 patients, die in doctors' hands. Bulgarian man dies of self-immolation after protests against poverty. A 39-year-old died on Monday in hospital after suffering over 80% burns while setting himself on fire on February 20th to protest against government corruption. Also, with high electricity rates and poverty, Bulgaria has been hit by massive demonstrations in at least 10 cities. Lastly, 3 foreign firms control the country's power market, raking in most of the revenue from their utility services. This is GGN, and I'm Darko. Thank you.